The laugh broke out of Eleanor Harrow before she could close her teeth on it, and it rang the length of the silent dining hall like a dropped spoon. She had not meant to. She had bowed her head with the rest of them, folded her chapped hands in her lap, and waited through the longest grace she had ever sat under, the Duke of Ravenscourt intoning each word as though he were laying stones on a grave. And it might have stayed buried, the laugh, if the old wolfhound under the table had not chosen that exact instant of held breath to sneeze with such violence that the silver epergne rang and the footman jolted, and a single hothouse grape rolled off its pyramid and bounced twice across the polished mahogany before coming to rest against the base of an empty wine-glass that nobody had filled. Nobody moved. Nobody so much as breathed, and it was the not breathing that did it. The absurd, total solemnity of 11 grown people pretending a dog had not sneezed and a grape had not bounced, that struck Eleanor as the funniest thing she had witnessed in the whole of her 25 years, and the laugh came up out of her like water out of a cracked dam. She clapped her hand over her mouth. Too late. The sound had already gone up to the painted ceiling and come back down again, and every face at the table had turned toward her, white and appalled, as if she had stood on her chair and sung a tavern song. At the head of the table, the Duke of Ravenscourt lowered his hands from the steeple he had made of them. He looked at her. She had been told in the carriage by the dour woman from the agency that the Duke had not smiled in 7 years. She had taken it for the kind of thing servants say, an exaggeration polished smooth by repetition.
Now, meeting his eyes down the length of that frozen table, she believed it utterly. They were grey eyes, and they were not cruel, which somehow made them worse. They were the eyes of a man who had simply mislaid the use of his own face and never gone looking for it. He was young to look so old. He could not have been past 31, dark-haired, broad through the shoulder, handsome in the severe way of a house shut up for the winter, and entirely, perfectly still. "Forgive me," Eleanor managed. Her voice came out smaller than she liked. The dog startled me." The wolfhound, hearing himself discussed, thumped his tail once against the floor. To Eleanor's left, a small girl in unrelieved grey was staring at her, with an expression Eleanor could not at first read. Beatrice Vane was 8 years old and seated very straight, her hands in her lap exactly as Eleanor's had been, and her face, pale, fine-boned, far too composed for 8, held something that flickered and was gone before Eleanor could name it. It might have been horror. It might have been hunger. With a child that quiet, the two looked very much alike. "You will find," said a voice from the foot of the table, dry as old paper, "that we do not laugh at Ravenscourt, Miss Harrow." The speaker was an elderly woman in deep grey silk, her white hair dressed without a single ornament, her spine as straight as the child's. The Dowager Countess of Renmere. Eleanor had been presented to her on arrival, and had felt, even then, that she was being measured for a coffin. The Dowager did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The whole house, Eleanor was beginning to understand, was tuned to the pitch of her displeasure, the way a kennel is tuned to its master's whistle. "No, my lady," Eleanor said. "I see that." The Duke said nothing at all. He picked up his spoon. The grace, apparently, was over. And the meal that followed was the strangest Eleanor had ever eaten. 11 people, a child, a wolfhound, and an empty place laid in full at the Duke's right hand. A plate, a glass, a folded napkin pressed into the shape of a lily. Nobody touched it. Nobody looked at it. The footman served it as though someone sat there, ladling soup into a bowl that was carried away again untasted at the end of the course. And Eleanor, watching the steam rise off that abandoned soup and curl into nothing, felt the laughter go entirely out of her, and something colder come in to take its place. 7 years. A man who had not smiled in 7 years, in a house that still set a place for the dead. What, she thought, have I walked into? She had walked into it because she had nowhere else to walk. That was the plain truth, and Eleanor Harrow was too honest with herself to dress it otherwise. 3 months ago, she had been the second daughter of a respectable Norfolk gentleman with 400 a year and a comfortable rectory's worth of expectations. Then her father's heart had stopped over his breakfast eggs. The 400 a year turned out to have been 300 of debt, and the comfortable expectations had been sold at auction, along with the pianoforte. Her elder sister had married a curate who could not house an extra mouth, and Eleanor, who had been raised to pour tea and sketch ruins and refuse second helpings, had discovered in herself one marketable quality. She had been so thoroughly educated, to ornament a marriage that never came, that she could teach. So she had laughed. She had laughed at the auction, and laughed at the agency, and laughed in the carriage, because she had learned, somewhere in the wreck of the last year, that a woman who laughs is a woman nobody pities. And being pitied was the one thing Eleanor could not survive. Laughter was her armor. It was also, she suspected, the only thing that kept her from lying down in a ditch. She had not expected to need the armor before the soup. That night she was given a candle and shown to a narrow room in the cold wing above the schoolroom, and she sat on the edge of the bed in her traveling dress and listened to the great house tick and settle around her like ice on a pond. Somewhere below, a clock struck 11. No voices, no music, no closing doors. A house of nearly 40 servants and one duke and one little girl, and it was as quiet as a chapel after the mourners have gone home. Eleanor blew out her candle. In the dark, she let herself stop smiling for the first time since Norfolk, and found that her face ached. The schoolroom, she discovered the next morning, faced north, and had not seen a fire lit before noon in living memory. "His Grace does not hold with indulgence in the nursery," said Mr. Glass, the butler, when Eleanor inquired. Mr. Glass was a long, grey, perfectly correct man, who appeared to have been carved from the same cold stone as the house. "Miss Beatrice has her constitution to consider." "Miss Beatrice has her chilblains to consider," Eleanor said, looking at the child's small reddened hands. "I should think a fire might be considered an aid to constitution, rather than a threat to it. But perhaps the philosophy is different in the north." Mr. Glass looked at her as though a footstool had spoken. "I will inquire of Mrs. Holt," he said, naming the housekeeper, in a tone that meant the fire would not be lit. When he had gone, Eleanor crouched down in front of Beatrice, who was standing by the window in her grey dress with her grey ribbon and her grey, watchful eyes, holding a slate against her chest like a shield. "Well," said Eleanor, "we are both new here, you and I." "You are not new," said Beatrice. "You are the governess. I have had 4. 4? In how long?" 2 years. The child considered. "Miss Pym cried. Miss Dover did not cry, but she left in the night and did not say goodbye. Miss Acton said the house was haunted, and grandmother dismissed her for impertinence. The last one I do not remember." She delivered this without self-pity, as a clerk reads a ledger. "You laughed at dinner. Grandmother will dismiss you too. I should not become attached." Eleanor felt something turn over in her chest. Recognition, sharp and unwelcome, like meeting your own face in a strange mirror. She knew that voice. She had used that voice. I should not become attached. It was the voice of a person who had decided that wanting things was a luxury they could not afford, and had decided it far, far too young. "That seems very sensible," Eleanor said gravely. "And yet I find I have become attached to you already, so I'm afraid the plan is spoilt." Beatrice stared at her. "You cannot have. You have known me since yesterday." "I am impulsive. It is one of my worst faults. My mother despaired of it." Eleanor stood and brushed off her skirts. "Now, Mr. Glass has denied us a fire, the dowager has denied us laughter, and the room is, frankly, the temperature of a fishmonger's slab. So we shall have a lesson in geography. And the lesson is this. We are going to find the warmest room in the house, and we are going to occupy it, like Vikings. A long silence. Then, in a very small voice, as if confessing to a crime, "The kitchen is warm. Then to the kitchen we sail." It was not, of course, allowed. Almost nothing at Ravenscourt was allowed, Eleanor was rapidly learning. The house ran on a vast and intricate machinery of things that were not done, and at the centre of the machine, turning every wheel, sat the Dowager Countess of Renmere, who was not even the Duke's mother. She was his late wife's mother. Eleanor learned this from the cook, Mrs. Bellamy, a wide, warm, flowery woman, who turned out to be the single source of heat in the entire establishment, and not only because she stood nearest the ovens. "Her ladyship's daughter was the Duchess," Mrs. Bellamy murmured, pressing a hot bun into Beatrice's hands, while the child sat on a stool by the great range, with her boots actually steaming. "Her Grace Cordelia, loveliest creature you ever saw, and the house. Oh, miss, you should have seen the house then, lit up like a fair, music in the long gallery, and the doors never shut, and her Grace laughing fit to wake the rooks." The cook's wide face folded. 7 years come this Christmas she's been gone, and the old Countess came for the funeral and, well, she never went home, and the doors have been shut ever since. "What happened to her?" Eleanor asked, low, with Beatrice 3 feet away pretending not to listen, and listening with her whole body. "Mrs." Bellamy's eyes flicked to the child. "Not for small ears," she said. "There was ice. There was a night. That's all I'll say in this kitchen. But His Grace was not always a graven image, miss, whatever you've seen. He used to be the warmest man in 3 counties. He used to carry that little one on his shoulders down to see the new lambs." She wiped her hands hard on her apron. "Grief does queer things to a great house. It freezes from the top down." Eleanor looked at Beatrice, at the small, steaming boots, at the half-eaten bun, at the careful, ledger-keeping eyes, and felt her armour of laughter slip, just slightly, and something fiercer move underneath it. She had come here to earn her bread. She understood that. A governess who forgot it did not stay a governess long. But nobody, she thought, nobody had carried this child on their shoulders to see the lambs in a very long time. "Eat your bun," she told Beatrice, and was rewarded, astonishingly, with the very faintest twitch at the corner of the child's mouth. Not a smile, the ghost of the rumour of a smile. It was, Eleanor decided, a beginning. The ritual of dinner, however, did not bend, and on her second night Eleanor learned exactly how much it would cost to test it. She had thought, innocently, she saw afterward, that she might say something, nothing large. Beatrice had spent the afternoon drawing a remarkably good map of the imaginary kingdom of the upper corridor, and Eleanor, seated in the long silence between the fish and the joint, had leaned the smallest degree toward the child and murmured, "You did the river very well today," because it seemed to her a monstrous thing that a child should sit through an hour of food with no one permitted to say a kind word across it. The dowager's fork came down against her plate with a click that was not loud and silenced the whole table, as a pistol shot would not have done. "We do not converse at meals, Miss Harrow." The old woman did not look up from her plate. "The dinner hour is for reflection." "For reflection upon what, my lady, if I may ask?" It was the wrong question. Eleanor knew it the instant it left her. But it had left her, the way things did. The Duke, at the head of the table, went very still over his untouched wine. Mr. Glass, behind the dowager's chair, closed his eyes briefly, as a man does before a blow. "Upon those," said the dowager, "who are not at this table to converse with us, and never will be again. Some households remember their dead, Miss Harrow. Perhaps in Norfolk you do things differently." And there it was. The empty place at the Duke's right hand. The plate, the lily-folded napkin, the glass no one filled. invoked without a glance, the whole frozen architecture of the house resting its weight on that one untouched setting. Eleanor looked at it, at the steam rising off the soup that would be carried away untasted, and understood that she was not sitting at a dinner table at all. She was sitting at a graveside, and had been since she arrived. And every meal in this house was a funeral that had never once been allowed to end. "I beg your pardon," she said quietly. "I meant no disrespect to anyone, living or otherwise." The Duke said nothing, but once, between the joint and the sweet, Eleanor felt his eyes on her, down the length of the candlelit table. And when she lifted her own to meet them, he did not look away as quickly as a man should. And she saw in them, she was almost sure she saw, not anger at her trespass, but something far more dangerous to them both. He looked at her the way a man looks at an open window in a shut room, as though he had forgotten such a thing was possible, and could not quite decide whether the draught coming through it was a torment or a mercy. Afterward, on the back stair, Mrs. Bellamy caught her sleeve. "You want to mind her ladyship, miss," the cook whispered, not unkindly. "3 governesses she's seen off. The agency's near run dry of them. There's talk His Grace will give the whole thing up after Christmas. Send Miss Beatrice to her ladyship's people in Bath, where she may be raised proper and cold, and never trouble anyone." Her wide face creased. "This is the 7th Christmas, miss. Her ladyship has it fixed in her head that 7 is the year it's all to be settled. The child sent away, the house shut up half the year, the master never to wed again. Settled. Like an estate." She pressed Eleanor's hand. "You've a kind heart, and I'd not see it broke. But that little one hasn't long before they pack her off to the cold. If anything's to be done, miss, it wants doing now." Eleanor climbed the rest of the stairs slowly, the candle throwing her shadow huge and wavering up the cold wall. Now, she thought, a child a fortnight from being parcelled off to Bath to be finished into a smaller, quieter, greyer version of the woman at the foot of the table. A duke a fortnight from giving up the last warm thing he had. She had come here to earn her bread and keep her head down, and she heard, distinctly, the head-down plan crack straight across like ice under a boot. She met the Duke properly 3 days later, and she met him by breaking a rule. The library at Ravenscourt was the one room in the house Eleanor had been expressly forbidden. His Grace's particular province, Mr. Glass had said, in the voice he used for commandments. Naturally, therefore, it was the room Eleanor most wanted to enter. And when she discovered that Beatrice's lessons required an atlas, and that the only atlas in the house lived in the forbidden library, she felt the requirements of duty and the promptings of curiosity link arms and walk her straight to the door. It was ajar. A fire. An actual fire. The first she had seen burn freely in that house, threw red light across a wilderness of books, and the Duke stood at the far window with his back to her, perfectly still, a glass of something amber untouched at his elbow. He did not turn. For a moment Eleanor thought he had not heard her, and she began, very quietly, to back out again. "You may take the atlas," he said without turning. "It is the green one, on the second shelf by the globe. That is what you came for." Eleanor froze with one hand on the door. "Your Grace has the hearing of a bat." "I have the hearing of a man who lives in a silent house, Miss Harrow. It comes to the same thing." Now he did turn, and the firelight caught the gray of his eyes, and the hard line of his jaw, and the faint, surprising shadows beneath, the marks of a man who did not sleep. "You are the one who laughed." It was not a question, so she did not answer it. She crossed to the shelf and found the green atlas where he had said it would be, and as she lifted it down, she said, because she could never in her life leave a silence alone, "I'm also the one who has been holding lessons in the kitchen, because the schoolroom is colder than the moors. But I assumed your Grace had larger concerns than the temperature of a nursery." She heard him exhale. It might, in another man, have been the beginning of a laugh. In him, it was only breath. The schoolroom has no fire, because my wife's mother believes that comfort breeds frivolity, and I have not had the... He paused, and chose the word with visible care, as a man crosses thin ice. The energy to contradict her these 7 years. Light the fire, Miss Harrow. Take the atlas. Teach the child wherever you can keep her warm. Thank you, Eleanor said, and meant it. And then, because she was Eleanor Harrow and could not help herself, she added, "She is a remarkable girl, you know, Beatrice. She keeps accounts of her own heart, the way a banker keeps a ledger. And she has decided not to love anyone in case they leave. I find it a very efficient system. I used it myself for a year. I do not recommend it." The Duke went very still. Stiller, if such a thing were possible, than he had been before. "You will not," he said at last, and his voice had gone cold and flat as the frozen pond outside. "Presume to lecture me on my daughter." "No, Your Grace," Eleanor said. "I would not dream of it." She tucked the atlas under her arm. At the door she stopped, because the look on his face, not anger, she realized, but something flinching and raw behind the anger, like a man struck on an old wound, would not let her leave it quite alone. "I only meant," she said more gently, "that someone ought to tell her she is allowed. That is all. Good evening." She went out and shut the door, and stood in the cold corridor with her heart going hard, and was furious with herself the whole way up the stairs. "You will be dismissed before Sunday, you fool. You cannot afford to be dismissed." And underneath the fury, stubborn and quiet and entirely unhelpful, the other thought, the one that had nothing to do with her wages at all. He flinched. Whatever is frozen in that man, it is not dead, it only flinched. The fire was lit in the schoolroom the next morning. Mr. Glass supervised its lighting, with the expression of a man assisting at a heresy, and the Dowager said nothing, which was worse than if she had said a great deal. But it was lit, and Beatrice, sitting close to it with her cold hands spread to the blaze, looked up at Eleanor with naked astonishment. "You asked him," she said, "and he did it." "I did not ask him for anything," Eleanor said, opening the green atlas. "I merely complained loudly in his vicinity, which is a different and far more ladylike thing. Now, put your finger on England." The weeks that followed were a campaign, and Eleanor fought them the only way she knew how, with warmth smuggled in like contraband. She could not change the great machinery of the house, the silent meals, the shut doors, the empty place still laid each night at the Duke's right hand. But she found in the schoolroom a small kingdom she could rule, and she ruled it like a benevolent pirate. Geography became a game of imaginary voyages. Arithmetic became a contest with sweets smuggled up from Mrs. Bellamy for prizes. When the snows came in earnest and shut them indoors, Eleanor declared the long upper corridor a kingdom in need of a map and set Beatrice to surveying it, and the sound of a child's footsteps running, actually running, in that hushed house was so unprecedented that 2 housemaids came to the foot of the stairs to see what was wrong. It was on the coldest night of that first fortnight that Eleanor learned the Duke kept a vigil of his own. She woke past midnight to the sound of crying, thin, muffled, the particular hopeless weeping of a child who has learned to do it quietly. Beatrice. Eleanor was out of bed and down the freezing passage in her shawl before she was properly awake, and she pushed open the door of the night nursery to find the child sitting bolt upright in the dark, rigid, her face wet, caught in the aftermath of some dream she could not climb out of. And kneeling at the bedside, already there, one large hand hovering an inch above his daughter's hair, as though he had forgotten whether he was permitted to touch her, was the Duke. He looked up at Eleanor in the candlelight, and she had never seen a man so undefended. He was in his shirt sleeves, his dark hair disordered, and the cold composure he wore like armor by day had simply not been put on yet. She cries out, he said, very low, as if confessing a sin. Most nights. I hear her, the floor above mine. I have heard her cry out most nights for 7 years, and I have never once known what to do for it. I come up. I stand in the door. And then I go down again because I do not. His voice cracked on the plainest word. I do not know how. Her mother would have known. I only ever know how to stand in doorways. You may sit on the bed, Eleanor said gently. That is the whole of the secret. You sit down where she can reach you, and you let her decide whether to come. He looked at her as though she had handed him a key to a door he had been beating his fists against for years, and then, slowly, like a man much older than he was, the Duke of Ravenscourt sat down on the edge of his daughter's bed, and Beatrice, half asleep, not weighing it, not keeping accounts of her heart for once in her careful little life, simply turned and burrowed against his chest and held on. Eleanor watched the man's arms come up around the child, awkward, astonished, infinitely careful, and watched his face go down into her hair, and she had to grip the doorframe hard against the sudden ache in her own throat. What does she dream of? Eleanor asked, when the child had gone soft and heavy with sleep against him. Falling, the Duke said. Always falling. Ice that will not hold. He was quiet a moment, his cheek against his daughter's hair. She was a year old when her mother... when it happened. She cannot possibly remember. And yet she dreams of ice that will not hold every winter. And I've never told her a word of how it was, and I cannot account for it. Unless a house can pass its nightmares down to its children like a fever, through the walls. Houses can, Eleanor said softly. Children breathe in what the grown people will not say. The not saying does not protect them, Your Grace. It only leaves them frightened of a shape they cannot name. She hesitated, then dared it. What was she like, her mother? For a long moment she thought he would freeze again, retreat, stand up and go back down to his cold rooms. But the dark and the sleeping child, and perhaps the open window of her plain question, undid something in him. Loud, he said, and the word came out broken and amazed, as though he had not let himself reach for the memory in years and was startled to find it still warm. She was loud. She sang in the corridors, and she could not keep a secret to save her life, and she laughed. God, she laughed at everything, at me most of all. She said I was the most solemn man in England, and she had made it her life's work to ruin me. His mouth did something that was not a smile, but remembered the country a smile came from. She nearly succeeded. I was warm once, Miss Harrow. Hard as it may be for you to credit it, she made me warm. And when the ice took her, I found I could not bear to be warm anymore, because every warm thing in this house had her shape, and He stopped. He looked down at his daughter. I froze it. All of it. I told myself it was grief. I think now it was only cowardice with better manners. It was love, Eleanor said. Frightened love. They look very alike in the dark. He raised his eyes to hers across the sleeping child, and the candle guttered between them, and something passed in the small warm circle of its light that neither of them named, that neither of them could afford, that came anyway. Good night, Miss Harrow, he said at last, roughly. Good night, Your Grace. She went back to her cold bed and lay awake a long time, and was angry with herself, and could not stop seeing the man's astonished face going down into his daughter's hair, and knew, with the sinking certainty of a swimmer who has gone out past her depth, that she was in very great trouble indeed. And Beatrice began, by inches, to thaw. It was nothing anyone else would have noticed, but Eleanor, who had made a study of the child the way a sailor studies weather, marked every degree of it. The first time Beatrice asked a question that was not about lessons. The first time she said, "I think," instead of, "Grandmother says." The first time, bent over a sketch of the wolfhound, whose name, it transpired, was Hector, that she laughed. A quick, startled bark of laughter that she immediately stifled with both hands, her eyes flying wide with alarm, looking to Eleanor for the punishment that did not come. That, Eleanor told her solemnly, was a laugh. They are not rationed. You may have as many as you like, and there will still be more tomorrow. It is the one thing in this house that does not run out. Beatrice considered this radical doctrine. Grandmother says laughing is for people who have forgotten their grief. Your grandmother, Eleanor said carefully, is very sad, and has been sad a long time. And sad people sometimes mistake their own walls for the shape of the world. But you are 8. You are not required to keep her walls. You are required to learn your sums and love your papa and grow up. And you cannot do the last of those frozen solid. The Duke she saw rarely, and always by accident, and always, she became uncomfortably aware, by an accident she had half arranged. He took a turn about the South Terrace each afternoon at 4, alone, in all weathers, and the schoolroom window happened to overlook it. And Eleanor happened, more often than chance could account for, to be standing at that window at 4 o'clock. She told herself she was watching for Beatrice's sake. She was a poor enough liar that she did not quite believe it. He walked like a man pacing the length of a cell, up and down, the snow squeaking under his boots, his head bare to the cold, his hands clasped behind him. And once, only once, he stopped directly below the window and looked up, and caught her there, and for a moment, neither of them moved. Then Eleanor, with great composure, lifted her hand and waved at him, exactly as one waves at a child across a churchyard. He did not wave back. Of course he did not, but he stood a moment longer than he needed to before he resumed his pacing. And that night at dinner, the dreadful, silent dinner, with the empty place laid and the dowager presiding over the gloom like a figure on a tomb, Eleanor caught him looking at her down the length of the table, and when she met his eyes, he did not look away at once, and something passed between them in the candlelight that had no name and made the back of her neck go warm. She was being a fool. She knew she was being a fool. A penniless governess, 3 months from the auction of her father's pianoforte, mooning at a duke across his own dinner table like a housemaid at a fair. It was precisely the kind of folly that ended with a girl turned out without a character, and Eleanor had seen what became of such girls. She lectured herself sternly. She resolved to keep her eyes on her plate. She kept this resolution for nearly 4 days. The thing that broke it was the music box. She found it by accident. She found most things at Ravenscourt by accident, the house being so thick with locked rooms and shut doors that a person could hardly cross it without stumbling on a secret. She had taken a wrong turning looking for Beatrice, who had a child's genius for vanishing, and found herself in a part of the east wing that smelled of dust and disuse, the furniture under Holland covers like a room full of ghosts. And there, on a marble-topped table, sat a small thing under a glass dome, an enameled music box, painted with lilies, a tiny silver key in its side. She lifted the dome before she could think better of it. She turned the key, only a little, only once, she swore to herself afterward, only enough to hear. And the box gave out 3 notes, sweet and thin and inexpressibly sad, the opening of some old air she half knew, before a hand came down hard over hers and stopped the key. Eleanor's heart leapt into her throat. It was the dowager. But it was not. It was Mrs. Holt, the housekeeper, and her severe face was, Eleanor would remember this for a long time, not angry. It was stricken. There were tears standing in the old woman's eyes, bright in the dim light, and her hand over Eleanor's was trembling. "Don't," Mrs. Holt whispered.
Please, miss, don't wind it. We don't. Nobody winds it. Not since. I'm sorry,
Eleanor breathed.
I didn't know. I'm so sorry.
The housekeeper took her hand away. She drew a square of linen from her sleeve and pressed it once to her eyes, quickly, ashamed. And when she spoke again, her voice had gone formal and stiff. The housekeeper's voice, the armour going back on.
It was Her Grace's, she said. It played at her wedding. His Grace gave it to her.
She set the glass dome back over the silent box with infinite care, as though tucking in a sleeping child.
He cannot bear the sound of it. None of us can. Come away, miss. You should not be in this part of the house.
Eleanor came away, but she had seen, in that unguarded instant, what the whole frozen house was built to hide. That it was not made of stone, after all. It was made of grief. Every shut door, every cold hearth, every silent grace. Grief packed and pressed and frozen hard as the pond in the park. And underneath it, still, the water moved. They had all loved her. The cook, the housekeeper, the silent duke, the watchful child who could not remember her own mother's face. They were not cold. They were drowning, all of them, in the same dark water under the same hard ice. And they had agreed, the whole household, to call it peace, because the alternative was to feel how cold it was. And Eleanor Harrow, who had spent a year doing exactly the same thing behind a wall of laughter, recognized it the way one shipwrecked sailor knows another. That night she did not lecture herself about folly. She lay awake instead, and thought about a man pacing a frozen terrace, and a music box nobody could bear to wind, and an empty place laid each night for 7 years. And she thought, they have mistaken stopping for safety. They think if they only stay still enough, hold their breath long enough, the grief cannot find them. But it has already found them. It lives here. It pays the wages. Somebody, she thought, has to start the music again. She did not yet know it would nearly cost her everything. She proved her worth to the Duke, as it happened, on an ordinary grey Tuesday, and she proved it the only way she knew, by standing between a child and a cruelty. A carriage came up the drive unannounced, which at Ravenscourt was an event on the order of a comet. It belonged to Lady Marcham, the nearest thing the district had to a great lady besides the Duke himself. A handsome, avid woman, with a nose for scandal, as keen as a hound's. And she had come. Eleanor understood it within 90 seconds of being summoned to the drawing-room, to confirm with her own eyes the delicious rumour that the grim Duke of Ravenscourt had been seen laughing in the snow like a madman, and that the cause was a bold nobody of a governess who had quite turned the house upside down. The dowager was abed with a headache. The Duke had not yet been found, and so it fell to Eleanor, in her one good moss-green gown, to receive the county's chief gossip, alone, with Beatrice standing white and rigid at her side.
And this,
said Lady Marcham, raking the child with a bright, pitiless look,
is the poor motherless creature. How she has grown, and how very like she is. No, perhaps not. One forgets. They say the child is quite backward, shut up here in this tomb with no mother and no... Well...
She turned the smile on Eleanor like a lamp.
And you are the governess everyone is talking of. The one who has the Duke behaving so very strangely. Tell me everything, Miss Harrow. The whole county is agog.
Eleanor felt Beatrice flinch at backward, the way she might flinch from a slap, and felt her own old armour come up bright and ready, and chose, in the space of a breath, to use it not to protect herself, but the child. Oh, the Duke behaves with perfect strangeness, Lady Marcham, she said, sailing into it, pouring the tea the Duke had not ordered with the serenity of a duchess. He insists his daughter be the best educated girl in 3 counties. Quite eccentric of him.
And I'm sorry to tell you Miss Beatrice is so far from backward that she corrected my Latin on Tuesday and my geography on Thursday, and I've begun to fear for my position. As for the laughing," she handed the cup across with a confiding warmth that gave the woman nowhere to stand. "Surely you would not have it whispered about the county that the Duke of Ravenscourt is incapable of taking pleasure in his own child's company at Christmas. What a melancholy thing that would be to repeat. I am certain a lady of your standing would far rather carry the truth, that Ravenscourt is the warmest house in the district,
and its master the fondest father in it.
People do so look to you to set the report straight."
Lady Marcham opened her mouth and shut it, and discovered she had been handed, with both hands and a cup of tea, the precise story she would now be obliged to repeat if she did not wish to seem the one spreading malice against a duke.
"Well," she said. "Well, quite. Just so."
And she drank her tea, defeated and not entirely sure how, and took her leave a good deal sooner than she had meant to. It was only when the carriage had gone that Eleanor turned and found the Duke standing in the doorway. He had come in halfway through. She did not know how much he had heard until he crossed the room, crouched down to his daughter's height, and said with a quiet ferocity she had never heard in him, "You corrected her Latin?"
"On Tuesday," Beatrice whispered. "Miss Harrow said amo when she meant amat. I did not mean to be forward."
"You were not forward. You were correct." He looked up at Eleanor over the child's head, and there was something in his face that had not been there before. Not warmth only, but respect, the regard of one defender for another. "I have had stewards and solicitors and a regiment of governesses in this house, Miss Harrow," he said, "and not one of them ever stood in front of my daughter and took a blow meant for her. I will not forget that you did." And Eleanor, who had been called bold and impulsive and forward her whole life and never once useful, found she had to look very hard at the tea things to keep her composure. It was that same evening, carrying a candle down the long gallery, that she came upon the dowager alone. The old woman did not hear her. She stood at the dark end of the gallery before a portrait Eleanor had passed 100 times without truly seeing. A young woman in white, laughing, caught by the painter half-turned, as if someone out of frame had just said something wicked, her dark hair coming down, her whole face alight. Cordelia. And the Dowager Countess of Renmere, who ruled the frozen house with a fork laid down and a single dry word, stood before her dead daughter's laughing portrait, with one hand pressed flat against the gilded frame, and her rigid spine bowed at last, her head bent, her shoulders moving in the silent, terrible, undefended grief of an old woman who has outlived her only child. She made no sound. She did not know she was watched. In her other hand, held against her breast, was a small, worn child's mitten. Grey wool, the kind a baby wears, kept 7 years. Eleanor stepped back into the shadow before the candle could betray her, and went away the other way, and did not breathe until she reached the stairs. She had hated the dowager a little, she realized, for the cold, for the cruelty to the child, for the threat hanging over her own place. She found she could not hate her any longer. She had seen the mitten. You cannot hate a grief that holds a dead baby's mitten in the dark. You can only fear what it has the power to do. The chance came with Christmas, or rather with the absence of it. December deepened. The snow lay a foot thick over the park, and the rooks went silent in the bare elms, and Eleanor, who had grown up in a house where Christmas was a riot of holly and goose, and her father reading the Nativity in his good voice, waited for some sign that the season was acknowledged at Ravenscourt. None came. No greenery was cut. No spices appeared in Mrs. Bellamy's kitchen. The calendar advanced toward the 25th, and the great house took no more notice than a stone takes of a feast day. "We do not keep Christmas," Beatrice informed her, when Eleanor finally asked. The child said it the way she said everything that came from her grandmother, flatly, by rote, a coin worn smooth from handling.
Mamma died at Christmas, so we do not keep it. We have not kept it since I was a baby.
She bent back over her copybook.
I do not mind. I do not remember keeping it, so there is nothing to miss.
But her pencil had stopped moving, and Eleanor, watching the small bent head, the careful stillness that cost a child so much to maintain, felt something in her own chest that was not quite anger and not quite grief, but partook of both, and made up her mind in the space of a breath.
Beatrice, she said, do you know what I think? I think your mother would be very sorry to learn that the way you all remember her is by being miserable. I think, and I knew her not at all, so I may be quite wrong, but I think a woman who filled this house with music would not want it kept as a tomb on her account. I think she would want you to have a goose.
Beatrice looked up, her eyes very wide.
We could not. Grandmother. Leave your grandmother to me, Eleanor said, with a confidence she did not entirely feel. I am only the governess. If anyone is to be blamed for a little holly and a little goose, let it be the governess. That is what we are for.
She should have left her grandmother to herself. She understood that afterward. But there was a fortnight to Christmas, and a child who had never in her remembered life hung a single sprig of greenery, and so Eleanor did the thing she would do all her life when faced with a frozen room. She opened a window. Quietly, at first, a bough of holly here, tucked above the schoolroom door. A length of ivy wound up the cold banister of the back stair, where only the servants went. She enlisted Mrs. Bellamy, who wept into her flower and then, drying her eyes, produced from some deep cupboard a hoard of cinnamon and dried oranges she had not had the heart to throw away in 7 years. She enlisted the housemaids, who were starved for it, who fell on the small rebellion like prisoners on daylight. She enlisted Hector, the wolfhound, who could be relied upon to look festive if a ribbon were tied to his collar, and to eat the ribbon within the hour. And the house. Eleanor felt it. Everyone felt it. The house began, very faintly, to breathe. The Duke noticed before the Dowager did. She came down one morning to find him standing in the great hall before a swag of holly and bright-berried ivy that the housemaids had hung over the cold fireplace at first light, and she stopped dead on the bottom stair, certain she was about to be sent away within the hour. He did not turn. He looked at the holly for a long moment. "Who did this?" he said. Not a question. Never a question with him. "I did, Your Grace." Eleanor came the rest of the way down. "The maids hung it, but the fault is mine. I asked them to. If it offends you, I will take it down myself this instant, and we need say no more about it." He was silent so long she'd begun to reach for the holly when he said, very low, in a voice she had not heard him use before, "She used to hang it just there. Exactly there. Cordelia." She said the hall was a face, and a house without greenery at Christmas was a face that had forgotten how to. He stopped. His jaw worked. "She would tie it with red ribbon," he said. "You have used red ribbon." "Mrs. Bellamy had it by," Eleanor whispered. She did not dare move. "Your Grace, I am so sorry. I never meant. I did not know it was hers, the place. I only thought—" "Leave it." He turned, and his face was terrible, and it was not terrible with anger. It was terrible the way ice is terrible at the moment it begins to crack, when you hear the first deep groan of it, and do not yet know which way it will go. "Leave the holly, Miss Harrow." And he walked out of the hall and out of the house, bareheaded into the snow, and she watched from the window as he stood in the white park, with his back to the great cold facade, and his shoulders shaking, once, twice, before he mastered it. She did not know, watching, whether she had done a great kindness or a terrible cruelty. She only knew she could not have done otherwise. That was the week the Duke began to thaw, and Eleanor, who had set out to warm a child, found to her terror that she had begun to warm the father too, and herself most of all. It came in small, impossible increments. He came up to the schoolroom, the Duke, climbing the nursery stair he had not climbed in years, on the pretext of inspecting the fire, and stayed half an hour listening to Beatrice recite the rivers of England, and when the child stumbled over the Trent and looked up in fear of him, he said only, gravely, "I never could remember it either. Your mother used to say it ran backward out of spite." And Beatrice's face did a thing Eleanor had never seen it do. It opened, like a door, in pure, wondering joy at being given a piece of her mother she had never owned. He began to take his afternoon walk along the south terrace at the precise hour the schoolroom emptied, and to find Eleanor and Beatrice building a snow fortress in the lee of the yews, and to be drawn, stiffly at first, as a frozen hinge is worked loose, into the engineering of it. He could not, at first, play. He had forgotten how, the way he had forgotten how to smile. The machinery was rusted. But he could carry stones for a snow rampart, and he could be appointed, by an imperious 8-year-old, chief defender of the North Wall. And he could stand in the falling snow, holding a snowball he plainly had no idea what to do with, looking from it to his daughter's bright, expectant face, with an expression of such helpless, dawning bewilderment that Eleanor had to turn away to keep from weeping, or laughing, or both.
"You throw it, Papa,"
Beatrice instructed with enormous patience.
"at the enemy. Miss Harrow is the enemy."
"Miss Harrow," the Duke said, "is a great deal of things," and threw the snowball, and missed by a yard, and Beatrice shrieked with joy, and Eleanor, retaliating, caught the Duke of Ravenscourt squarely in the chest with a fistful of snow. And for one suspended instant, the whole world held its breath the way it had held its breath at that first frozen grace. And the Duke laughed. It came out of him rusty and broken and astonished, a sound that seemed to surprise him more than anyone, a sound a man makes when a door he had nailed shut blows open in a high wind. He put his snow-wet hand to his own mouth as if to feel whether it was real. Beatrice went absolutely still, staring at her father. And then she flung herself at his legs and held on, and the Duke stood in the snow with his arms full of his daughter, and snow on his coat, and the broken laugh still on his face. And over the child's head, his eyes found Eleanor's, and what was in them was no longer frozen at all. Eleanor's heart turned over, and lay still, and turned over again. "Oh," she thought, with the particular clarity of a person watching herself walk off a cliff. "Oh no, you cannot. He is a duke, and you are nobody, and this ends one way, and you know which way it is. You felt-mannered fool. You armored, laughing fool. Not him. Anyone but him." But it was already too late, and she knew it. The way you know a hard frost is coming by the particular stillness of the air. She had come to Ravenscourt to thaw a frozen house, and somewhere in the thawing, she had gone and lost her own foolish heart entirely, to a grieving man and his solemn child, and a goose she had not yet been permitted to roast. That was the state of things, fragile, impossible, brimming, when the dowager came back from her week at Renmere and found her dead daughter's house hung with holly, and went to war. Eleanor was summoned to the small parlour the dowager used as a fortress. The old woman sat very upright in a chair of black oak, and she did not ask Eleanor to sit, and the holly that someone had not had time to remove from the mantel had been taken down and lay on the floor at her feet like a slain thing. "You have been busy, Miss Harrow," the dowager said. "I've tried to make Miss Beatrice's lessons agreeable, my lady." "You have hung my daughter's house with the rubbish of a season that killed her. You have taught my granddaughter to run and shout in corridors where her mother's coffin was carried out. You have made my son-in-law into a—" The dry voice cracked, just perceptibly, and the dowager pressed it flat again with visible force. "Into a spectacle, laughing in the snow like a stable lad,
where the whole county may see what becomes of a great man who forgets himself. You think you have brought warmth into this house." She leaned forward, and her eyes, Eleanor saw, were not cruel either. They were the Duke's eyes grown old, the same flinching wound dressed in 50 more years of armor. "You have brought forgetting, and I will not have her forgotten. Do you understand me? I buried my only child. The least, the very least that is owed her is that this house should not learn to be happy without her in it." And there it was. Eleanor understood, all at once, the whole terrible architecture of the place. The Dowager had not frozen Ravenscourt out of cruelty. She had frozen it out of love, out of the unbearable terror that if the house thawed, if it laughed and kept Christmas and went on, then her daughter would be truly gone, erased, replaced. That warmth was a kind of forgetting, and forgetting was a kind of erasure. A second loss she could not survive. She had made the whole household into a monument, because a monument, at least, does not move on.
"My lady,"
Eleanor said, and her voice shook, because she was about to say the truest and most dangerous thing she had ever said.
"I do not think anyone in this house is in the smallest danger of forgetting her. I think you are all so busy not forgetting her that none of you can remember her at all. There is a music box in the east wing that no one can bear to wind. There is a place laid for her every night that no one can bear to eat at. Her own daughter cannot recall her face. That is not remembering, my lady. That is being haunted. And the dead deserve better of us than to be made into ghosts." For one moment, one single moment, something moved behind the old woman's face. Some terrible crack of recognition, there and gone. Then it closed, and the Dowager said, in a voice of perfect winter, "You will be gone by the new year, Miss Harrow. I shall speak to my son-in-law tonight. Get out of my sight." Eleanor got out. She had expected to feel afraid. She was to be dismissed. She had no character, no savings, nowhere on this earth to go. And she did feel afraid, but underneath the fear was something that surprised her. A hard, bright, defiant thing. And it took her halfway up the stairs to recognize it as the absolute certainty that she had been right. Whatever it cost her, she had been right. She did not know it was about to cost her far more than her place. The Duke did not dismiss her that night. Whatever passed between him and the Dowager behind the library door, and their voices were raised, actually raised for the first time in Eleanor's hearing, two muffled tides of anger rising and falling past midnight. It did not end in her dismissal. In the morning, the holly was still up. The Duke looked grey and unslept and said nothing at breakfast, but he did not send for her, and Eleanor allowed herself, against all sense, to hope. The evening of the 22nd gave her every reason to. It began with greenery, and ended somewhere Eleanor had no business letting it end. She had been stringing ivy along the schoolroom mantel after lessons, Beatrice handing her sprigs, and keeping up a stream of fierce opinion about which was the handsomest, when the Duke appeared in the doorway. And this time, he did not stand in it. He came in. He took off his coat, rolled back his cuffs, and asked, with the gravity of a man volunteering for a forlorn hope, how he might be of use. "You may hold the holly," Eleanor told him, "and you may try not to bleed on the carpet. It is the one genuinely dangerous task in the room, and I judged you equal to it." "You have a low opinion of my courage." "I have seen you throw a snowball, Your Grace. I have formed my estimate accordingly." And the Duke, the grim, frozen, 7 years silent Duke of Ravenscourt, laughed. And the laugh did not surprise him this time. And that was how Eleanor knew the ice had truly gone. Not the laughing, but the not being startled by it. They hung the greenery, the three of them, in the firelit schoolroom, while the snow came down soft and steady past the dark window. Beatrice,
granted a free hand with the lower reaches of the mantle, produced an arrangement of such lopsided enthusiasm that the Duke surveyed it at length and pronounced it structurally unsound, but spiritually magnificent. And Beatrice glowed, as if he had given her the garter.
It was when the child had fallen asleep at last in the old nursing chair by the fire, ivy still tangled in her loosened hair, that the room went quiet and warm and dangerous. The Duke stood looking down at his daughter for a long time. Then he said, not turning, "I have not asked whether you will stay. Beyond the quarter, I mean, whether you would consent to stay." He drew a breath. "She is to go to her grandmother's people in Bath in the new year. That was the arrangement. It was made before you came, when I believed the kindest thing I could do for a child was to send her somewhere warmer than I knew how to be." He turned, and the firelight was on his face. "I no longer believe that. I find I no longer believe a great many things I was certain of a month ago. I should like her to stay. I should like—" And here the careful, exact man ran entirely out of exactness. "I should like you to stay." Eleanor's heart was going so hard, she was certain he could hear it. "As her governess," she said, because someone had to say the safe thing, and she could see he would not. "As whatever you will permit," the Duke said simply. "I am too far out of the habit of hope to ask for more than you will give. But I will tell you the truth, Eleanor, because I have spent 7 years telling myself comfortable lies, and I find I have lost the taste for them. When you waved at me from that window like a girl across a churchyard, I went inside, and I stood in this house, and for the first time in 7 years, it did not feel like a place I was waiting to leave. You did that. A penniless, impertinent governess who lit fires she was not permitted to light." His mouth curved. Not the broken thing from the snow, but something steadier, something that meant to stay. "When the lilacs come out in the spring, along the south terrace, they were Cordelia's. She planted the whole hedge. I should like you to be here to see them. That is as far ahead as I have let myself look in 7 years. The spring, the lilacs. You, there to see them." It was the most either of them had ever said, and it hung in the warm air between them, and neither moved to take it back. "I should like that very much," Eleanor said, when she could trust her voice. "The lilacs. And I should like, Your Grace, Julian." His name felt enormous in her mouth. "I should like to stay so much that it frightens me, which is how I know it is real, because the things I truly want have always frightened me half to death." He crossed the room. For a moment she thought, she was almost sure, but he only lifted her hand, ink-stained and chapped and ridiculous, and held it a moment between both of his, and pressed his mouth to her knuckles once, with a gravity that undid her far more thoroughly than any kiss could have. "In the spring, then," he said. When he had carried his sleeping daughter up to bed, Eleanor knelt by the chair where the child had been, and found, fallen from her loosened fist, the small enamelled music box. Beatrice had carried it down. She must have slipped into the east wing and taken it, the forbidden thing, and held it all evening through the decorating without a word. "B," Eleanor said softly, the next morning, the morning of the 23rd, holding it out. "You took your mother's music box." The child's chin came up, braced for punishment. "I wanted it for Christmas. You said warm things were not rationed. I thought Mamma's music ought not to be rationed either. I thought we might wind it, on Christmas morning, you and I together, so I would not have to do it alone." The defiance wavered. "Was I wrong? Is it not allowed?" And Eleanor, drowning in the whole brimming impossible warmth of the night before, with the lilacs promised and the spring promised, and her foolish heart entirely given away, did the thing she would spend one terrible day wishing she could call back. She knelt and folded the child's hands around the box and said, "It is allowed.
Everything is allowed now, my darling. We shall wind it together on Christmas morning, you and I, and we shall hear the very song your mother was married to, and it will be the most beautiful sound this old house has heard in 7 years. I promise you. Keep it safe until then. She should not have hoped. Hope in that house was the thing that thawed the ice you were standing on. And a promise, to a child who had just learned she was at last allowed to want things, is a coal carried in the bare hands. It will be kept, though it burns. It was the 23rd of December, and it began with the dowager discovering the glass dome empty. Eleanor heard it before she saw it. The old woman's voice raised, actually raised, ringing down from the east wing in a register of pure outrage. And she came out of the schoolroom to find the household frozen on the stairs, and the dowager descending in a fury so cold it scalded. The empty glass dome held out before her in both hands, like evidence at a trial. "The box is gone," the dowager said, and her voice shook the banisters. "My daughter's music box, taken from its place, by a child who has been taught this month past that nothing in this house is sacred, that every locked door is hers to open, that grief itself is again to be decorated with red ribbon." Her terrible eyes found Eleanor across the hall. "This is your doing, Miss Harrow, and it ends today. The girl goes to Bath within the week. I will write the letter this hour. The greenery comes down. The box is locked away where no impertinent hand can reach it. And you will be gone by morning, with or without your son-in-law's leave, for I am still this family's elder, and I will see my daughter's memory defended though I do it alone." She turned to the white-faced butler. "Find Miss Beatrice. Bring me the box." But Beatrice was not to be found. She had been on the upper landing. Eleanor knew it the instant the words left the dowager, had seen from the corner of her eye a small grey shape that had been listening on the stair above, and was no longer there. The child had heard every word, that she was to be sent away to Bath, that Miss Harrow was to be turned out by morning, that the music box, her mother's music, the promise of Christmas, the one warm thing she had let herself believe in, was to be taken and locked in the dark forever. A search of the schoolroom and the kitchen and the long gallery turned up nothing, and the snow began again, thick and silent and blinding, and the first cold finger of real fear touched the back of Eleanor's neck, when a housemaid came running, white as her apron, to say that Miss Beatrice's good cloak was gone from its peg, and so were her boots, and the small door to the east garden stood open, with the snow already drifting across the threshold. Eleanor knew it the way you know a thing in a nightmare, all at once, and far too late. The child had taken the box, had taken her mother's music away from the hand that meant to lock it up, and she had run, not to fetch anything, to save it, to hide the one piece of her mother she possessed, somewhere her grandmother's reach could not follow. And there was only one place in all the white world that an 8-year-old believed belonged to her mother and not to the house. The little shut summer house at the far end of the east garden, the one Mrs. Bellamy had once said her Grace loved above any room indoors. And the path to it ran the whole length of the ornamental water, the long frozen pond where, Eleanor understood now with a lurch that stopped her heart, 7 years ago at Christmas, a young duchess had walked out and not walked back. She was running before she had finished the thought, out into the blizzard, no cloak, screaming the child's name into a white wind that snatched it from her mouth, following the small, fast-filling prints across the buried garden toward the pond. And the world had narrowed to that. The prince, the wind, the terror. Please, please, not the child. Anything but the child. She found Beatrice at the very edge of the ice. The child had not gone on to it. Thank God, thank every God there was, she had not gone on to it. She had slipped on the snow-hidden bank and turned her ankle and gone down half in a drift, and she was soaked and shaking and blue-lipped and weeping with cold and fright,
the small enamelled music box clutched against her chest under her cloak, wrapped in both her arms, kept dry, kept safe, the most precious thing in the world. And Eleanor fell on her knees in the snow and gathered her up, child and box and all, and wept into her freezing hair, and felt the small heart beating fast and alive against her own. And only then, with the child safe in her arms, did she look up and see that she was not alone. The Duke stood 10 feet away, at the edge of the frozen water, white as the snow, staring at his daughter in Eleanor's arms, with an expression that stopped Eleanor's blood. She had thought she had seen this man frozen. She had not known what frozen was until she saw his face in that instant. For he was not seeing this child, this living child safe and crying in the snow. He was seeing the other thing, the night 7 years gone, the ice and the dark, and the Duchess who had walked out onto the winter pond and not walked back. And he was reliving it whole, his whole body locked rigid with a horror 7 years deep. And when his eyes came up at last from his daughter to Eleanor, they were not the eyes that had laughed in the snow 2 days before. They were a stranger's eyes. They were ice all the way down. "Inside," he said. His voice had no warmth in it anywhere. "Get her inside." They carried Beatrice in and stripped off her frozen things, and Mrs. Bellamy bundled her by the great kitchen fire, wrapped in blankets, with a hot brick at her feet. And the child, restored astonishingly fast in the way of children, was soon sitting up, demanding to know whether she might still wind the music box on Christmas morning. None the worse but for a turned ankle and a fright. She was safe. She was entirely, perfectly safe. Eleanor held that to herself like a coal. It did not matter. She understood, when the Duke sent for her at last, that it did not matter at all. He received her in the library, and he was standing at the window where she had first found him, his back to her, the old amber glass full again and untouched at his elbow. And the whole frozen architecture of the man had rebuilt itself, stone by stone, and she knew before he spoke a word that she had lost. "My daughter nearly died today," he said, to the black window. "Your Grace, she was never on the ice. She only slipped on the bank. She is perfectly—" "My daughter," he said, louder, and the control in it was worse than any shout, "walked out onto a frozen garden in a blizzard, to the very edge of the water where her mother—" The word would not come. He did not make it come. "Because you filled her head with Christmas, with music boxes and warmth, and the dangerous, dangerous idea that this house is a safe place to want things. I let you." He turned finally, and his face was a closed door, bolted and barred, and behind it she could see him bleeding, and could not reach him at all. "I let you thaw it. I knew better, and I let you. Because you laughed at my table, and I had forgotten, I had let myself forget, what comes of warmth in this house. Warmth is what walks people out onto the ice, Miss Harrow. Joy is the thing that gets taken away. I learned that lesson once, at a price I will not survive paying twice." "That is grief talking," Eleanor said, low and desperate. "That is not true. That is the most frightened thing I have ever heard a brave man say." "You will leave Ravenscourt in the morning." He said it flatly, finally, the way he said grace, laying stones on a grave. "You will be paid to the quarter and given a character that mentions nothing of today. I am not a cruel man. But you will go, and you will not write to my daughter, and this house will go back to being what it was, which is cold, Miss Harrow, and quiet, and safe." And there it was. Eleanor stood in the firelight, with the whole bright, impossible warmth of the last month going to ash in her chest. And she made herself look at it plainly, the way she had made herself look at the auction and the ditch, and every other ruin of her life. She had let herself believe she was wanted here. She had let a thawing man and a thawing child, and a goose she would now never roast, convince her that this once, This single time, the warmth she carried into a cold room might be allowed to stay. And she had been wrong, the way she was always wrong, the way the agency woman and the 4 governesses before her had all been wrong. He had let her in to warn the child, and the child was safe now, and the warmth could be put back out into the snow where it had come from. She had been a convenience. She had never once been kept. She did not cry. She was proud of that afterward, that she did not cry in front of him, that she kept her armor on to the very last. She inclined her head, exactly as a governess should.
"As your grace wishes," she said. "I will be gone by first light. Only—"
And here her voice did break, just once, just on the one thing she could not armor.
"Let her wind the music box, your grace, on Christmas morning. Let her hear it once. She has carried it through the snow at the risk of her neck, and she has earned the song. Do not make her grow up the way I grew up, deciding it is safer not to want things. That is all I ask. Good night."
She went up to the cold wing for the last time, and packed her one small trunk by candlelight. And she did not sleep. And at the very blackest hour of that black December night, she let herself, finally alone, stop smiling, and put her face in her hands, and grieve. He had been right about one thing at least, the Duke of Ravenscourt. Warmth was the thing that walked you out onto the ice. She had known it once herself. She had only, fool that she was, let herself forget. She was buckling the trunk before dawn when the knock came at the door. It was not the Duke. It was the Dowager. Eleanor straightened, every nerve braced for the last cold word, the final twist of the knife. But the old woman who stood in the candlelit doorway in her grey wrapper, her white hair down for the night, was not the figure of Winter who had ordered her gone. She looked, suddenly, only old. Old and undefended and awake, as if she too had spent the black hours with her face in her hands. In her hands she held a letter. The paper was old, foxed brown at the folds, the ink gone pale. And under her other arm, incongruous, she held the enamelled music box. "I heard him," the Dowager said. Her voice was strange, stripped somehow of all its dry authority. "Last night, through the library door, I heard what he said to you, and what you said to him. The most frightened thing I have ever heard a brave man say." She came into the little room and set the music box down on the closed trunk between them, very gently, as one sets down something living. "I have spent 7 years," she said, "teaching this house to be afraid. I told myself it was loyalty. I told myself it was love. I told myself that as long as we none of us moved, none of us laughed, none of us went on, she could not be truly gone, because nothing here had let her go." Her old mouth trembled. "You said the dead deserve better than to be made into ghosts. I have thought of nothing else since. I have made my granddaughter into a ghost to keep my daughter from being one. God forgive me. My lady, let me finish, or I shall lose my nerve, and I am too old to find it again." The Dowager pressed the letter flat between her 2 hands. "This came to me. After. It was among her things. Cordelia's. And I took it, and I have kept it 7 years, and I have never shown it to him, because I could not bear what it asks. She wrote it to her mother, to me. That last winter, the winter she was taken. She had grown afraid of the ice on the water, you see. She who had never been afraid of anything. She said that year the pond had a wrong sound to it, a thinness. And Julian laughed at her for it, and so did I." The Dowager's mouth shook. "She wrote it to be opened if her fear proved true, and folded it away among her letters. And her fear proved true that very Christmas. And I found it after. And I have carried it like a stone ever since. and never had the courage. She held it out.
Eleanor did not take it.
"It is not mine to read, my lady."
"No," the dowager agreed. "It is his. But I cannot. I find I cannot give it to him myself. 7 years, and I cannot. So I am asking you, you who walked into my dead daughter's house and dared to light the fires." The old eyes, wet now, held Eleanor's. "Do not get into that carriage, Miss Harrow. Take this to my son-in-law instead. And then, God willing, and if there is any warmth left in him that you have not already wakened, do not leave at all." Eleanor's hands were not quite steady when she took the letter. She found the Duke where she had known she would find him, in the library, at the black window, having kept his own vigil through the night. He did not turn at the sound of the door. "I told them to have the carriage round at 7, he said, his voice dead. "It is not 7. "No," said Eleanor. "It is not. Your Grace, I have something I must give you, and then I will go, and you need never see me again. But you must read this first. Your wife's mother has carried it 7 years. It is from Cordelia. She asks that you read it." That turned him. The name did what nothing else could. He crossed the room and took the old paper from her hand, and she watched his face as he unfolded it, watched him recognize the hand, watched something break loose behind his eyes. And then he read, and Eleanor, who had not read a word of it, watched 7 years of ice come apart in a man's face in the space of a single page. He read it twice. The second time his hand was shaking so that the paper rattled, and then he made a sound Eleanor had never heard a grown man make, a sound torn up from somewhere under the foundations of him, and he sat down, very suddenly, in the chair by the cold hearth, as though his legs had stopped, the letter pressed to his mouth. "Read it," he said, when he could speak. He held it out to her blindly. "I cannot. Read it, please." And so Eleanor knelt down by the chair of the man she loved and would never have, in the grey light of the shortest days of the year, and read aloud the last words of Cordelia, Duchess of Ravenscourt, written 7 years before to her own mother. "If you are reading this, then I am not there to make you promise it in person. So I must make you promise it on paper, and you must keep it though it costs you. Do not let them turn the house to stone. You will want to, you most of all, Mama, and Julian after you, because you both love by holding tight, and grief will tell you that holding tight means holding still. Do not believe it. I have been the happiest creature alive in these rooms, and I will not have my Beatrice grow up in a tomb on my account. Light the fires, keep the Christmas, wind the music box until the spring runs down, and then wind it again. Let her laugh. Oh, Mama, let my girl laugh. Promise me. Whatever else you cannot do, let her be a child who laughs. And tell Julian, tell him from me, that the worst thing he could do to honor me is to stop being warm. He will try. He is the warmest man I ever knew, and he will try to freeze it all to keep from feeling it. And you must not let him. Find them someone, if I am gone. Find them someone who knows how to laugh in a cold room. And let her in. Promise me you will let her in." The library was very quiet when she finished. The fire had gone out in the night, and neither of them had noticed. The grey light strengthened at the window, and somewhere far off in the waking house, a clock began to strike 7, and the carriage that was to take Eleanor away stood ready in the snow. The Duke lifted his face from his hands. "She knew," he said, wondering, wrecked, alive. "She knew what I would do. 7 years ago she knew exactly what I would do. And she told her mother to stop me. And her mother could not. And I—" He looked at the dead hearth, the shut house, the wasted years. I made her into the very thing she begged me not to. I froze the house to honor her, and the freezing was the one thing she could not have borne. His eyes came up to Eleanor's, and they were full, and they were warm, and they were terrified. Find them someone who knows how to laugh in a cold room. Your Grace, Julian, he said. My name is Julian. You have laughed in the coldest room in England for a month, and I dismissed you for it like a god, like exactly the coward she said I would become. He stood. He took her hands, both of them, in his, and his were warm now, warm and shaking, and he did not let go. I have no right to ask you for anything. I turned you out into the snow last night for the crime of warming my child. But I am asking, Eleanor, do not get into that carriage. Stay, not as a governess, or as a governess, if that is all you will have, I will take any terms. Only stay, and teach us, both of us, how to be a house that is alive. I cannot do it without you. I tried for 7 years to do the opposite, and it nearly cost me my daughter, and it has already cost me. His voice broke clean through. You. Stay, please. I am asking you to stay. Eleanor looked at him, at the wet, grey eyes that had learned to weep again, at the warm hands shaking around her cold ones, at the letter on the floor, and the dead fire, and the music box she had carried down under her arm. And she found that the armour she had worn her whole life, the bright, hard, laughing armour that kept the world from pitying her, had simply fallen off somewhere in the last hour, and she did not want it back. I should warn you, she said, and her voice was not steady at all, and she did not care, that I am impulsive, and I light fires where I am not allowed, and I will hang holly in every room in this house every December for the rest of my life. And I have been in love with you since you missed that snowball by a yard, which was, frankly, a humiliating performance for a man of your standing. And the Duke of Ravenscourt laughed. It was not rusty this time. It came up out of him whole and warm and astonished, and he pulled her into his arms in the grey light, with the carriage waiting forgotten in the snow, and he held her as though she were the thing he had walked out onto the ice to find. And Eleanor, who had not let herself be held in longer than she could remember, stopped laughing and let herself, at last, be kept. Stay, he said again, into her hair. Yes, she said. Try and put me in that carriage. I should like to see you manage it. They were married in the spring, when the lilacs his first wife had loved came out along the south terrace, in the village church a half-mile from the great house, with Beatrice scattering hawthorn and Hector the wolfhound disgracing himself among the wedding breakfast, and Mrs. Bellamy weeping happily into a goose the size of a footstool. The dowager gave the bride away. It had seemed, to everyone who knew the whole of it, the only right thing, that the woman who had frozen the house should be the one to hand its thaw across the altar. And the old countess did it with a straight back and streaming eyes, and afterward kept Christmas at Ravenscourt every year of her life with a devotion that frightened the kitchen. But that was the spring. The first thaw came at Christmas, 2 days after the carriage was sent away empty. On Christmas morning, Eleanor woke in the cold wing for the last time, and dressed, and went down to find that the whole house had risen before her. There was a fire in every grate, there was holly on every mantel, and ivy up every banister, and the smell of cinnamon and roasting goose climbing the stairs like a living thing. And in the great hall, under the swag of red-ribboned holly, hung exactly where a young duchess had once hung it, the entire household stood waiting, the Duke and the Dowager, and Mrs. Bellamy and Mr. Glass, looking deeply unsure of the proceedings, and the housemaids, and Hector, in a ribbon he had not yet eaten. And Beatrice stood in the middle of them, no longer in grey, in a gown the deep, glad red of hollyberries that Mrs. Bellamy had sat up 3 nights to make, holding her mother's enamelled music box in both her hands, with her father's hand on her shoulder, and her whole small face turned up, shining, toward the woman on the stairs. Miss Harrow, she said. "You promised. You said we would wind it together." The empty place was not laid at the long table that morning. It had been cleared at last, quietly, in the night, and a new place set instead, beside the Duke's, where the governess, who was to be a duchess, would sit. Eleanor came down the stairs and knelt in the firelight beside the child, and put her hand over the small, cold fingers on the silver key. "Together, then," she said. "On 3. Are you ready? It will be loud. It will be the loudest this house has been in 7 years. And that is exactly as it should be." And they wound the music box, the governess and the child, in a house full of fire, and the whole held breath of the watching household. And the old enamelled lilies turned, and the sweet, thin, married music spilled out at last into the warm, bright hall. The song the Duchess had been wed to, the song no one had been able to bear. And this time, no hand came down to stop it. This time the Duke stood with his arm around his daughter, and his eyes on the woman he would marry in the spring, and he let it play, the whole of it, to the very last falling note. And when the last note fell, in the firelit silence after, it was Beatrice who broke it. Beatrice, 8 years old, motherless and no longer alone, who looked up at her thawed and weeping father, and her laughing soon-to-be mother, and the grandmother, who had learned too late and just in time, and laughed. A clear, unstifled, unrationed peal of a laugh that went up to the painted ceiling and came back down again, and filled the cold house to its frozen corners with the one warm thing it had been starving for. And the Duke of Ravenscourt, who had not smiled in 7 years, threw back his head in the holly-hung hall on Christmas morning and laughed with her, and the sound of the two of them together was the sound of a long winter ending. "Happy Christmas, Papa," said Beatrice. "Happy Christmas, my darling," he said, and reached out his free hand to the woman beside him, and she took it. "Happy Christmas, all of us, at last." If you have ever carried warmth into a cold room and been afraid it would not be allowed to stay, this story was for you. And I would love to know, in the comments, what small fire you have lit in a place that needed one. If it warmed you even a little, stay by the hearth a while longer and subscribe, for there is always another story waiting, and the fire is always lit.